We're joined by Dr. Matthew Bunson, EWTN News Executive Editor. Matthew, thank you for being with us. Has the Catholic Pope ever added people who are not technically Catholic to the Roman martyrology?
Yes, this decision by Pope Francis came as a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, but it certainly cannot be called unprecedented. In the history of the Church, we have had a number of additions to the Roman martyrology of people who weren't perhaps in communion with the Church. And what I mean by that is that they may have been members of the Orthodox churches. I think in particular of Gregory Palamas, a 13th century Eastern theologian who had actually quite a few criticisms for Western Christianity, and yet was considered a great theologian and a great saint. We also have Ambrose of Smolensk, a Russian saint of the 13th century, who was actually canonized officially for the Church by Pope Paul III in 1549. But probably the best example is Gregory of Narek, an 11th century Armenian monk who not only was added to the calendar by Pope Francis, he was actually called a saint by John Paul II before Pope Francis. Pope Francis went so far as to name him one of the doctors of the Church. So this is not unheard of, but it's also a very powerful statement, I think, by Pope Francis of the importance of the witness of martyrs, especially today, as pointing all of us toward that unity that we face in giving that witness to Christ.
Now, Matthew, we use this phrase, in communion with the Church. What are the differences that make someone not in communion with the Church?
Well, primarily in this case, with the Orthodox, we have those who do not recognize the Pope as the head of the Church. That was a great sticking point over the centuries, and it remains one among the churches. We had disagreements, for example, theologically, as you noted, in terms of the Coptic Christians, who really split from Rome in 451 in the Council of Chalcedon over some of the more complicated matters in terms of Christology. But the big sticking point remains recognizing the Holy Father.
So it doesn't have anything to do with the nature of the Eucharist?
Correct. And that became important, as we know, with the celebration of the Divine Liturgy by Pope Tawadros II in Rome during his visit there.
We'll get to that in 1 second. So the Pope received relics of these 21 martyrs. Who were these men, Matthew?
These were average Coptic Christians and one other. There were 20 Coptics who were seized by ISIS. They were construction workers working from Egypt and in Libya in the city of Sirte. And they had among them a member of their group from Ghana. His name was Matthew Ayariga. We're not entirely sure even today what his background was in terms of his faith. But ISIS seized these 20 workers, plus this gentleman from Ghana, these Coptic Christians, and as you noted, and as the world watched in horror, executed them on a beach. All of them were immediately declared martyrs and were canonized by the Coptic Church. Matthew Ayariga stands as something of an outlier with this group, however, because like all of them, he was offered the ability, the chance to save himself. And each one of them, all 21, refused to abjure their faith, to give up Christ. It is said that Matthew Ayariga, again, who was apparently not a Coptic Christian, said, "Their God is my God." And at the very end, died with them. And notably, too, as we can see in the video, which I don't recommend anyone watching in any graphic detail, but all of them died with the name of Jesus on their lips, making them remarkable witnesses to Christ in the face of the horror of ISIS.
The Coptics in Egypt have suffered greatly. We mentioned a few ways in which they suffer persecution. What are the more egregious examples? Of course, this martyrdom is one of them.
Yeah, well, the Coptic Christians over the centuries have suffered immensely at the hands of the different controlling empires of Egypt. Think of the Fatimids as well as the Mamelukes and the Ottomans, names that are part of history. But it's been especially in the modern era that the Coptic Christians have suffered so immensely. We can think, for example, of the 2011 bombing that killed, I think, almost 24 and wounded over 100 in Alexandria. And then there are the sufferings of individual Coptic Christians in Egypt on a daily basis at the hands of those who simply hate Christians, who are on the watch, for example, for any accusations of blasphemy against Muhammad or the Islamic faith. So it is a day-to-day existence that they face, and that's something that I think we have to be reminded of. And I think this statement by Pope Francis and the canonization of them by the Coptic Orthodox Church is so significant in terms of these martyrs.
They are significant moves by Pope Francis. Well, Pope Tawadros II celebrated the Divine Liturgy at the Basilica of St. John Lateran. There was recent outrage after the Church of England held a service in the same church. That service was blamed on a, quote, failure of communication. Why is a Mass by the Coptic Orthodox Patriarch allowed and not the other one?
Well, we're comparing theologically and sacramentally apples and oranges. In the case of the Anglicans, our position on that is that they are not, in terms of the apostolic succession, that these are not valid priests. And therefore, the celebration of the Eucharist is not valid either. In the case of Pope Tawadros, we recognize that the sacraments of the Orthodox Church are valid. They are in schism and remain so. They're not in communion, but because they have maintained the apostolic succession in terms of our belief, and for us, it was an important distinction that had to be made, and very quickly. In addition, as you noted, the Anglicans celebrated their liturgy in the Basilica, the Archbasilica, because of a failure of miscommunication. In the case of the Divine Liturgy by Pope Tawadros, this was something that had been organized very carefully, and steps had been taken to make certain, for example, of which altar was used and that everything was done appropriately.
There are a lot of rules surrounding that. Well, thank you so much for all of this clarity, Matthew.